Hi everyone, happy holiday season, happy new year. In today's video, we're painting a loose and expressive watercolor winter wreath using simple step-by-step techniques. So grab your supplies and let's start painting. Be sure to check out the description box below to see all the supplies I'm using throughout the tutorial. Alright, so I always start my wreath paintings with a simple sketch of a circle. You can use really anything you want and just gently trace around it. I used the bottom of a candle. You can also use a cup or a mug or a roll of masking tape, just anything circular that fits your size of paper. Mine is 6 by 8. And make sure when you trace that circle, it's dark enough that you can see it well and we can add our different wreath elements on top of it. But you don't want it to be too dark to where you'll see that pencil mark through the painting. So go ahead and get that traced onto your paper, and then we'll start with the first layer of leaves. For this painting, I'm using a size 5 round brush, and if you're familiar with my other wreath tutorials, I always recommend starting lighter and then building darker layers on top. If you start out too dark, you're not going to leave yourself enough room to really build layers on top of it. So to get a lighter value, you're just going to water down your mixture. So you can see I have my sap green with a little deep sap green in here, but I'm not pulling it directly from the paint. I've added quite a bit of water in there, so it's nice and diluted. And we're going to start applying our first layer of leaves. Now this first layer, as I mentioned, will be lighter, and it's also going to be pretty spaced out. So to start with this first leaf, I'm going to use the tip of my brush and kind of pull out a dainty little stem off to the side. At the end of the stem, I'll push my brush down. You can see the bristles expand out, and I'll do another stroke right next to it to create a nice big fluffy leaf. You can leave the little gap in there if you want, or you can fill it in. I'm going to do a mix of different types of leaves as I work my way around. Now this first layer, we want to be able to add in our berries and our other layers on top of it. So this first one, we want to make sure we space out so that we have room to add those in. So I'm going to add another leaf coming off to the side here, same thing, painting a little dainty stem, and then a nice big round leaf coming off of it. But before I add the next one, I'm going to leave a bit of white space here because I want to have plenty of room to add in a bunch of red berries and also some additional layers of greenery. So I don't want it to be too busy before I have a chance to add those things in. So let's leave a good amount of white space, and then I'm going to go ahead and add another little stem of leaves, but this time they're curving on the inside of the wreath. So these two were pointing on the outside of the wreath. The next one's going to be on the inside. And that's going to help our wreath stay nice and organic looking and loose. I say this probably in all of my wreath tutorials, but you never want it to look too perfect or too uniform. So make sure you're really varying the direction of your leaves, the shape of your leaves, the size of your leaves. So for example, I don't just want to have the same exact 2-stem leaf here. I'm going to add a third one, just a little tiny guy coming on the very bottom. It's almost just like a little dot, tiny little leaf just like that. So that's what I mean when I encourage you to vary your elements as you work your way through this wreath project. Just make sure every time you add something, it's a little bit different than the one you had before. So let's add a third stem here, coming off and pushing down to create that leaf shape. I will link up at the top of this video another tutorial I have that is just focused on painting leaves. So if you find this part challenging, I definitely would recommend you watch that tutorial. But I'm basically just pushing down and creating a thicker stroke for these leaves. I'm just working my way around. You can see I'm leaving plenty of white space in between each of these so that I have room for the berries. Let's leave a little more space. And this one's coming on the inside. So using the tip of my brush, creating a very dainty line just like that before pushing down to create the thick part of that leaf. So go ahead and work your way around, adding in this very first layer of leaves, making sure to leave that white space so we have room to add on. Now when you get to this stage, take a step back. I always encourage you to take a step back as you work on projects like this Sometimes you get so focused in that it can end up looking a little off balanced or uneven, so always take a step back, see any patterns that you're noticing. I'm noticing that I need a little bit more coming off of this side and a little something extra coming off of these two. So all of these stems have 3 leaves, these have 2, which is totally fine, but it is looking a little unbalanced having the full branches here and then the smaller ones over here. So I'm just going to use my intuition and add a couple more elements here and there. That one's a little too dark, so I'm going to soak up some of that pigment just using clean bristles. Lighten that up a bit, and then I'm going to add a little bit more on these smaller leaves. And your project might not need everything that mine needs, so you definitely don't have to follow every single step that I'm doing. Just be sure to step back and really take a look at yours and see what it needs. Also remember not to go overboard at this stage. We have a long way to go. We're going to add a lot of berries and darker leaves, so it's always better to err on the side of not having enough than going too heavy right off the bat, and then your wreath will just look a little bit too full. Now for this second layer, I'm going slightly darker value. So I'm grabbing some deep sap green and adding it into my sap green and using a little less water so it's more pigmented. And I'm going to continue adding in some leaves, but this time they're going to be slightly different. I want all these different elements to look a little bit different to keep the wreath interesting. So I'm going to make these ones a bit longer. So again, starting with that thin little stroke for the stem, pushing down, pulling it out a little bit further so you can see that stem is quite a bit longer. And that's going to help differentiate this layer from the one we just did. I'll add another one here. Pulling it out and lifting back up. And I do still want plenty of room to add in my berries, so I'm not going to add too many here, but just kind of differentiating and adding some unique little pieces of foliage here. And this is really what makes wreaths look beautiful, in my opinion, is having a good mix of elements. You can have some overlapping, you can have some going every which way. But if you just paint the same leaves over and over, it doesn't always look very realistic or very lush. It just looks a little too perfect. So you can see this leaf is overlapping that first layer. And that's why I always recommend going from light to dark, because the second layer is darker than the first, so it lays on top of it nicely. If I were to start too dark and then try to add lighter layers on top, you wouldn't be able to see them. So always start lighter than you think and then build darker layers on top. Leaving some white space, adding a dainty stroke, and pulling out that leaf. So go ahead and add your second layer of leaves, making sure it's slightly darker than the first and making sure your leaves are a little bit different. All right, so we have 2 layers of leaves at this point. So now I'm going to switch over to my red mixture and start adding in my favorite part, which is the berries. I'm using a mixture of Perylene Maroon and Permanent Alizarin Crimson. So I'll show you my red mixture. I am going to show you a technique that I like to do when I'm painting berries like this that helps me create some that are really dark and bold and vibrant, and some that are really light in value. And I love having that contrast when I'm painting pieces like this. So for the first berries, I'm going to take a super dark value. So you can see I'm pulling it kind of straight from that blob of paint. So it's dark value, very pigmented. And I'm going to start by painting a simple little berry. And I'm going to leave a white space for the highlight of the berry. So just a tiny little white space and a basic circle shape. Now I'm going to rinse off my brush completely, so I just have clean water in my bristles, and I'm going to paint another berry right next to this one, and I'm going to barely just brush that first one to pull some of that deep, bold color into my second berry. Let me bring you in a bit closer so you can see this process better. So I have my dark red berry, and I'm going to paint another one right next to it. I have clean water in my brush, And I'm just gonna barely touch that outer edge of the first berry, and you can see that color start to bleed into my second one. Again, I'll leave a white space for a little highlight, and I'm gonna soak up some of that excess water so it's not too dark. And now you can see how beautiful that contrast is between a light berry and a dark one right next to it. And we have that little bleed of color between the two, which is just one of my favorite things when I paint wreaths like this. So I'm gonna just continue adding in a few berries. And just like we did with the leaves, some of these berry branches are gonna have 3, some of them will have 2, some will have more, or sometimes I'll just add a berry here or there kind of floating by itself. So we wanna really vary the amount and the style of berries that we add throughout so that it looks very natural and it looks like these berries are just kind of organically tossed in this wreath. I'm gonna add one that's kind of overlapping this leaf here off on its own. And that's what I'll start with, and then I'll add some more berries further along this wreath. It's really up to you how many you want to add or what styles you want to add them in. You can have them all be super dark or super big. I like to have a variety, so some of my berries will be very big and bold and dark. Others will be nice and small and dainty. That's just my preference, is to have more of a tossed look, but as always, these artistic choices are up to you because you're the artist. So again, I'm just barely tapping that outer edge so that some of that bold pigment bleeds into this second berry. Let's add a couple more overlapping these leaf stems. And again, making some small, some bigger, some lighter, and some darker. And I actually like this kind of more spaced out look rather than the clumped berries that I first did. So I'm going to actually add a few more down here, and then I'll stick to that spaced out look for the rest of this wreath. But that's the fun part of being an artist, is you can make these choices and just kind of experiment with different styles as you go, see what you like, and then apply those changes to your paintings. So go ahead and work your way around, adding in these berries. Make sure not to go too heavy on the berries because we are going to add in a few more dark layers of leaves, and we'll probably end up adding some more berries as well. So just kind of fill in these white gaps, make sure they're spaced fairly evenly, and then we'll meet back up to add some additional greenery. Okay, so our wreath is coming along nicely. We have our first layer of leaves, our middle layer of leaves. We have a bunch of berries, different sizes, different values. So now I'm going to take an even darker value of green. So I'm pulling straight from my color. I'm adding in quite a bit of deep sap green, and I'm going to start by connecting all the berries. So these are just going to be tiny little lines using the very tip of my brush. I'm not going to be applying too much pressure. But I don't want these berries to look like they're just floating out in space. I want them to look like they're connected and they're a part of this wreath. So using the very tip of my brush, making very dainty strokes, I'm just going to create thin little lines like this to connect each of these berries. So just creating these tiny little connecting lines, and that way it looks like they each have little stems that are helping them connect to all the other elements in this wreath. And you don't have to create separate lines for each little one. You can just kind of indicate that we know there are stems there, but you don't need to show each and every one. For the most part, I just want them to look like they're not, like I said, floating by themselves. So just creating these little dainty lines, and you can see because this is a deep dark green that I'm using, it overlays those first few layers of leaves really nicely. It's not overpowering it because they're little dainty lines, but you can clearly see this dark green on top of the first and second layers of green. So just work your way around, adding in these little dainty connecting stems. So you can see here, for example, I'm just adding a little line here. It's not necessarily connecting to anything specific. You're just indicating that it's a part of this stem, just like the rest of them. And we'll add some final leaves after this, but I always want all the elements of my wreath to look like they're a cohesive part of the painting. So just going to add these little connecting lines. They don't have to be perfect. Again, just using the very tip of my brush. I'm not applying any pressure. Just letting the tip drag across the paper to create that very dainty line. Just like that. So now at least all of our berries are connected, and now I'm going to keep that same color in my palette. So it's the same deep sap green, very pigmented. I'm going to load up my brush, and I'm going to add this final layer of leaves. Now this is really where you can just kind of go crazy and have fun with it. We're using such a deep dark green that you can really layer on top of anything you want. So for example, I'm going to layer on top of this mid green, create a stem, push down, and look how nicely that overlaps that green because this final layer green is so much darker. And I'm just going to find these areas where I want to bring some of that bold green into the wreath. So some of the leaves I'm going to have coming off of the little berry stems like this. I'm going to create a little stem, push down. Some of them are going to be coming inside of the wreath and some will be going outside. Just pushing down and really filling out this wreath. Now I don't want to go too overboard here. I don't want this final step to make the wreath look messy. That's definitely not the vibe I'm going for. I want it to be nice and full and lush and layered, but not messy. So just be sure that you're taking a step back, analyzing your painting as you go, and making sure you're not overdoing it. You can always add more to a piece if you want, but you can't take away elements that you've already added. So you've heard me say it in all my other wreath tutorials, better to err on the side of not having enough and then going back and being able to add in more elements as you want than adding too many at this stage and then having it look a little too messy, but not being able to erase, essentially, any of your elements. So just work your way around, add in this final layer of leaves wherever you want. I like to add a mix kind of coming out of the berries like this, just dainty little leaves, and then others laying on top of the leaves that we've already painted. So like this one, I'm going right over that first layer and adding in these leaves directly on top. And you can see some of these leaves are really following that curve that we initially sketched out with the pencil. Some of them are going directly perpendicular, either on the outer or inner edge of the wreath. So that really just helps your piece look very lively and full, making sure you have some rogue leaves, in addition to, of course, having most of your elements following that circle. You do still, after all, want it to be a wreath shape, so don't go too crazy, but just kind of take a step back. Like right now I'm taking a look and I see some emptier spaces on this left side, whereas it's a little more busy on the right side. So I'm going to add a few more coming off on this side, overlapping. And you always want to be able to see the initial layers that you've done. So I don't want to totally cover up these lighter greens with this deep dark green. I just want it to layer on top and enhance those initial layers that we've already painted. So you can still see our first and second layers, but we're just adding these darker leaves on top and making our wreath look a little bit more full. Now at this stage you can also add berries if you want. You can always add more elements. So I want to add a few more berries on this side. We have lots of nice red pops of color on this side, but it's a little more bare here. So I'm gonna go back into my red palette. Make sure your brush is nice and clean. I don't want to get muddy colors with my green and red mixing together. So make sure your brush is always nice and clean when you're switching between colors. And just add any final touches that you want to your wreath. Like I said, we're not going to have the exact same wreath. So maybe you don't want to do exactly what I'm doing here, where I'm adding more berries. Maybe you want to add more leaves. Maybe you want to add some pine cones, or maybe you want to add some blue colored berries too. You can really have fun with it and make it your own. Just make sure you're taking a step back every now and then and not overdoing it. I'm just kind of identifying those areas that look a little bit too bare for my liking and adding in a few final elements. So that is going to be it for this tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again for joining me today, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more watercolor tutorials, and I will see you again in the next one.